Well, thank you very much, Dominic, for this generous introduction and also for the invitation that I received to be here. It is my first time in Göttingen, which is a wonderful place. Hopefully it will not be the last occasion that I'm here, that I have to come back. And thank you, the audience, for being here and listening to this talk. Well, in this occasion, I've chosen to be perhaps more provocative than conservative, and to take more risks that I should have done perhaps in a different scenario. After all, I'm not, and I should leave this clear from the very beginning, I'm not an expert in the history of medical collections. Neither am I an expert in museology. As many of you know better than me, our bookshelves have seen a scholarly interest in the history of science museum in general and medical collections in particular. Sam Alberti, Susan Peirce, Anke Tehesen, Emma Sparry, Susan Dudley, George Stocking, and Arthur McGregor are just some of the few names that have made important contributions in the field. To this, we should add, of course, the already classic books by Paula Findland or Katie Park and Lorraine Daston. Some of these works deal with the beginning of medical curiosities, like the collections of Peter I of Frédéric Rouge. Others have been produced on more contemporary issues, like the history of dermatology, embryology, pathology, or anatomical models. In all these cases, all this growing literature comes to suggest not just an increasing interest in the history of anatomical collections, but also a social critique of the role that audiences did have and still play in the formation and understanding of the human body. From the Renaissance Wunderkammer well up to the panoptics of the second half of the 19th century or the museums of public health of the early 20th century, the exhibition of the human body, either through anatomical models or specimens, has been an integral part of the scientific understanding of anatomy and of the popular enjoyment of the masses. Anatomical collections have indeed always appealed to the public, and yet the relationship between academic medicine, anatomical museums, and popular culture has been, and still is, extraordinarily complex. The Anatomy Museum in Leiden, for example, defines its collection as, and I quote, a set of theories, assumptions, and practices guiding the preservation, interpretation, and presentation of historical artifacts. The curators of this institution claim that the collection can be taken as a case study in order to understand how historical specimens should be presented and how their meanings have been transformed so as to fit today's interests. Finally, they also question how those who manage the collections should regulate public curiosity. They emphasize not just the reciprocal tension between audiences, public as well as professional, and content, what is on show, or how the meanings of anatomical objects have changed over time and in relation to the public. They also investigate the divide between professionals, in this case in medicine, and amateurs. This museum, which contains over 800 anatomical preparations and models, was nominated for the European Museum of the Year award in 2009. Perhaps as a consequence of what the curators thought was a search for respectable, and I quote, respectable ways of going public. The museum is in fact only open to the general public twice a year, a policy very different from the Wojave Anatomical Museum, also in Leiden. This latter institution, which claims to be the Dutch National Museum of the History for the History of Science and Medicine, and which counts with thousands of objects on all branches of medical sciences, does not seem to be bothered at all by the public presentation of human remains. On the contrary, the anatomical collection seems to offer a theoretical framework for posing challenging questions on the relationship between the fate of the human remains, the medical profession, and the public gaze. To put some more pressure on these issues, I do not think that these two different museums deal with medical history. On the other hand, I don't think that medical history should or could be displayed. The most successful examples of medical museums that would eventually come up to our minds, the Wellcome Collection in London, the Science Gallery in Dublin, the Laboratoire in Paris, the Hygiene Museum in Dresden, are not in fact about medical history, but about the body. Its history, its understanding, its physiology, its functions, and its anthropological and cultural representations. At the same time, other very well-known collections on medical knowledge, on pathological anatomy, on history of dermatology or embryology, like the Berlin Medical Historical Museum of La Charité, the Musée Dupuytren in Paris, the Specola in Florence, the Guy's Hospital Museum in London, the Olavide Museum of Dermatology in Madrid, are not really about the body, but about the use of anatomical models for teaching purposes or public education. As in some other very well-known and well-established institutions, like the Medical Museum in Edinburgh, the Semmelweis Museum in Budapest, or the Hunterian Collection in London, part of their appeal rests on the reputation and national prestige of those involved in the collection, apart from the obvious quality of the material involved, which is very often presented as part of the label national heritage. In some other cases, however, like the Phallological Museum in Iceland, the Museum of the Mummies in Guanajuato, or the Musée Fragonard in Paris, we may have quite a different appeal. In the first one, the Phallological Museum, you will find around 300 specimens of penises from 100 different species, including, of course, humans. Not in vain, one of the attractions of the museum lies in the bronze cast models of the penises of the Olympic champion handball team that you could see in the picture. In the case of the Museum of Guanajuato, the Kunstgallery in St. Petersburg, or the Fragonard collection in Paris, the referent is still more elusive. Though obviously, these and many other collections are an incredible source of inspiration for many scholars, including medical historians, they seem to have a life of their own, without a clear identification of its social function or its academic interests. Without a serious renovation in its curatorial policy, the Museum of Hygiene in Dresden would have very likely followed the path of its twin museum, the Hygiene Museum of St. Petersburg. After all, the project to educate on matters of health and personal hygiene was only implemented by the People's Commission in 1919 after the success of a Russian exhibition in Brussels. Today, visitors, mainly high school students, may certainly have gained some understanding about 20th century public policies on sexually transmitted diseases, but what they truly enjoy is a closer look at the well-preserved mummified dog of the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, that you can see there in the image. In a similar vein, the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, established during the Civil War as a medical research center and museum, has become a repository of human remains without a clear function. It was there that the authorities sent the lost limbs of the soldiers, and it was there that some of those soldiers, as the imaginary character of the neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell, a story George Detlow addressed himself to recover his legs. When they appear under the registration number 3486 and 3487 of the Medical Museum, George recognized them immediately. "Good gracious," he exclaimed, "they are my legs, my legs." The web Morbid Anatomy, one of the most comprehensive resources that you may find today on the web regarding the public display of the human body, counts dozens of museums and collections related one way or another to this particular function. The very title of this web page suggests an inclination towards that form of exquisite curiosity that was so common in the 19th century. Like the Musée d'Histoire de la Médecine in Brussels, which contains over 300 wax anatomical models showing the ravages of venereal diseases, many collections also walk through a very thin path between education and entertainment, knowledge and wonder, information and shock. Many of the items on display in Brussels, for example, are part of the Spitznack collection and show different parts of the human body afflicted by sexually transmitted diseases. In the 19th century, the Spitznack collection, as the collection of the Catalan Dr. Roca in Barcelona or the collection of Ghislain in Ghent, made it in fairgrounds throughout Europe in an attempt to warn common folks of the unpleasantness that could befall them. But it is not my intention to provide you with historical records on the history of medicine, of medical popularization. What I would like to do rather is to discuss, first of all, the necessary requirements to produce an exhibition on medical history, and then to introduce a more general discussion on knowledge transfer and public engagement. I would like to argue that the procedures, epistemic, political, and emotional, by which medical history is put on display in different collections and galleries may provide a new model of cooperation between science, including the humanities, on the one hand, and society on the other. My impression as a scholar, as a curator, as also as a former policymaker, is that the fortune of medical collection is linked to what is called knowledge transfer, and to the fears and hopes involved in what exhibitions and museums on the history of medicine tend to suggest. To shed some light on these social and cultural values involved in the display of medical history, I will follow my own guidelines when I prepare the Welcome Collection exhibition on the history of the human skin, which, as Dominic mentioned, gathered around 8,000 visitors in the year 2000, or the Science Museum exhibition on pain, which turned out to be a show visited by around 200,000 people. I give you these numbers not because I want to play trumpets in my own ears. There are always, and this should be clear from the very beginning, there are always more visited exhibitions as there are always better and wiser curators. But as we can learn perhaps by visiting the Phallological Museum, one cannot always say that size does not matter. These figures call seriously into question the alleged reduced scope of the humanities in general and of medical history in particular. In Spain, where we have a tendency to measure almost everything in terms of football stadiums, as we say, for example, that the surface burned by the last fires was equivalent to 20 times the Real Madrid stadium, 200,000 visitors means twice the full capacity of the Camp Nou in Barcelona. But let's go step by step. The election of the subject is, of course, the first step that potential curators should undertake. It seems obvious, but it has nonetheless few preconditions that I would like to point out. I do not mean here, of course, that it must be something somehow new that would eventually be of some interest for someone. What I mean to suggest is the need to undertake a polyphonic and truly contemporary approach. It might be worth remembering that for a long time, science museums' philosophy was based on the general idea that scientific knowledge was a product that had to be popularized. Within these two constraints, the understanding of science as a result and the vision of science museums as tools for popular education, visitors of the most important science museums in the West found in these collections big names, big theories, and big scientific pictures. This was in part reasonable since the philosophy of science that had encompassed those projects was based on a progressive narrative that also involved an unequal relationship between science and society. During the 1960s, and in order to avoid the ludicrous feeling that science, including here medical sciences, was far beyond the common citizen's reach and scope, many of these museums and galleries began to introduce interactive gadgets and activities. Come and play was the new motto of the day. As opposed to art galleries where you could not touch a thing, the new curatorial practices attempted to narrow the gap between knowers and users by means of new Baroque illusions and artificial tools. But the change on the sensory experience, as important as it was, did not in fact change the message. Like in the old times, the aim of science museums was like in the hygiene museums of the early 20th century, to contribute to the general education of a public regarded as purely passive in scientific matters. So passive, in fact, that science museums began to be understood as places designed mainly for children. The bulk of the visitors began to be formed very often by captive audiences of primary and secondary school students who visited museums and still do as part of their national education. It is unlikely, however, that kids dropped at the Museum of Hygiene in St. Petersburg will be appealed by the dangers of syphilis, and so it cannot come as a surprise if they simply stare at the mummified dog of Pavlov. The change undertaken in science museums during the last decades of the 20th century did not produce the corresponding effect in the curatorial practices. Despite the emphasis of the new social history of science, that the new social history of science plays in processes, activities, and negotiations, museums remained anchored in their own understanding of science, including medicine, and in their old-fashioned model of display, sometimes increasing the number of gadgets, and some others bringing in new guests, like dinosaurs and the like. The widespread idea that scientific practices, either from the past or from the present, were linked to wider political, social, or cultural issues and concerns, were rather ignored, in part due to the success of the previous policies and also for the fear of new ventures. For many, to produce a more dynamic imaginary of knowledge was not simply dangerous, but a relativistic concession that should be avoided. Within the new mindset of the museum's managers, the new approaches in the history and philosophy of science were considered clearly hostile to the interest of science and scientific practices, or at least clearly hostile to the wonderful results provided by the old narrative of endurance and progress. When it comes to the display of medical history, my first claim will be then to emphasize processes rather than results. The interest in the relation between science and culture does not necessarily imply cognitive or moral relativism. Quite the opposite. It contributes to the ideas that science, including medical sciences, is a cooperative and collective enterprise. On the other hand, the fight of museums to gain visitors from mature audiences might be perhaps better realized if we come to understand that visitors of science and medical museums no longer want to be educated. On the contrary, in our information society, many people do have the feeling that they already know a good deal about science, and plus, they do have the tools and the equipment to obtain information by other means. Curators perceive, not without reason, that attracting audiences to old museums has become increasingly difficult. T-Rex models may substitute tiger models, but children and parents alike don't want to go to the museum only to see in a different way what they have already seen in many other places, including movie theaters, documentaries, and so on. Keeping all this in mind, it might be easier and wiser to shift the policy of collections, and instead of emphasizing what we think people should know, we may very well begin by accepting that they know a good deal about what we want to present them. That is to say, instead of naturalizing the unusual, the marvelous, the infrequent, it might be wiser to take the opposite approach and question the common, the frequent, the normal. This is, in my view, part of the reason that explains the success of different galleries and exhibitions, mainly in the field of the history of the human body. Unlike other exhibitions on the history of relativity theory or quantum mechanics, our fields of inquiry are related to very common questions and quotidian problems. We talk about the body, and on that regard, about something which we all know a good deal about. But we may also present our exhibition creating a distance between what people thought and knew before the visit and what they may think and know afterwards. Our approach does not intend to educate, even less to indoctrinate in the benefits of medical sciences, but to make people think, or if you like, to think twice. In the case of skin, the exhibition focused on the largely human and nevertheless widely forgotten organ. The leading idea was to explore the cultural, scientific, and historical visibility or invisibility, transparency or opacity of the human skin. The exhibition presented skin images and skinned objects traveling through scientific, historical, and artistic barriers. We wanted to concentrate on the variations, repetitions, and internal temporality of a skin throughout history, and not just through the history of dermatology. We plan to offer the public an intellectual, but also an aesthetic and emotional experience of something, their skin, which we all know and are well acquainted with, though we seldom pay attention to its cultural dimension, collective use, and visual aspects. In this vein, the exhibition attempted to provide a kaleidoscopic view of skin visibility and invisibility in its historic, artistic, and scientific dimensions. I would like to give you some idea of how the exhibition looked like by Well, in the case of pain, we also paid attention to universally known phenomena. After all, we are aware of pain through our own feelings and personal experiences. We attempted to demonstrate, however, that pain was neither private nor unchanging. We were interested in pain as subjected to historical modifications and linked to cultural differences and modulations. Furthermore, the universality of pain should not be taken as a sign of its centrality to the human condition. On the contrary, pain, that was our aim, has historically been understood and reinterpreted as a means of salvation, as a sign of illness, as a symptom of an organic lesion, as a necessary element in teaching, and even as an essential condition of economic development, as we hear very recently. Only recently, we claim, pain has been given its own identity and value within the medical sciences as a particular condition of its own. In both cases, there was a relationship between visual and material culture of the human body, in both cases meaning in both the skin exhibition and in the pain exhibition. In the skin, we struggled to gain distance with regard to the constant visibility of the human skin. In pain, on the contrary, we fought to find the right images and objects to represent heart emotions and feelings. In the two shows, there was also a clear understanding regarding exhibition galleries as places where cognitive values got entangled or get entangled with emotional considerations. We did not fear that, on the contrary. As my own slides tend to suggest, there has been always, and still there are, an emotional dimension in the public display and exhibition of the body. Unlike some other academic resources that we may also have at our reach, exhibitions provide a wonderful possibility of mixing images, objects, movies, and sounds. In the case of the pain exhibition, we struggled to combine all the possibilities so that far from having a passive role, visitors will recover the nerve of what is to be emotionally moved in a show. I will give you just one example. I mean, we don't have information, we no longer have the information of that exhibition at the Wellcome Collection web. But then what I've done is to while the exhibition was there was a saeta singing. I mean, there was a recording of a saeta. A saeta is a particular Spanish song, mainly sung in Eastern. The name of this song comes from the fact that it also means little arrows, and it was employed. It was the procedure to killing bandits and outlaws in the 16th, 17th century in Spain. So it was a very painful way of dying. And after that, it was picked up by religious brotherhoods and things like that, and it is now sunk in Easter. So what you will hear now is a saeta with some of the images and objects that were presented at the Science Museum collection on pain. Well, that was something similar. It was also sung at the opening of the exhibition in the Science Museum with the sound of James Watt machine. That was a really impressive combination of things. Anyway, so the logical conclusion that would follow from what has been discussed so far is that changes in the topics and their approaches would unavoidably produce a new type of visitor and visitors of a different background. We need to concentrate in those who don't want to be taught but want to be questioned, those who don't want to learn but are willing to think. The combination between science, art, and history that has been proved so successful at the Wellcome Collection implies that many artists, historians, scientists visit their museum. They all feel that whatever is on display, there must be a matter of their concern. And that would lead me to my second issue, which is cooperative research. The change in the narrative and in the subject matter also means that there should not be a clear-cut distinction between first-class academic research on the one hand and curatorial research on the other. The display of medical history material cannot possibly be understood without new forms of professional cooperation, mainly between universities and museums, but also between researchers and other institutions. Multidisciplinarity here is, in my view, not an option. On the contrary, proper research for the organization of exhibitions and collections rests on different forms of teamwork between the sciences and the humanities, but also between public and private sectors. For the same reason, since exhibitions are not simply about ideas, but about the materialization of ideas, research should include not just written sources, but any other form of visual or material culture. The comparison of cultural codes and the changing historical meanings attached to the expression of the human body or the human health cannot be done without history, but it cannot be done either without science, art, music, or photography. Unlike some other forms of academic endeavor, exhibitions involve cross-disciplinary and cross-professional commitments, which makes research a truly cooperative endeavor that involves historians, but also historians of medicine, historians of art, philosophers, philologists, artists, and designers, curators of different collections and museums, engineers, architects, and so on. Perhaps one of the most visible aspects of this form of cooperative research lies in the link and connections between medical history and the art. In both the pain and the skin exhibitions, we worked in close cooperation with famous and not so famous artists. These exhibitions contained around 100 exhibits produced in several scientific and cultural contexts and times for different purposes and visual practices, using different visual techniques for the reproduction. All these images and objects contained ideas about perception, communication, decoration, cultural issues or symptoms of illnesses, deformations, and transformation. The cooperative nature of research seems nothing more than the logical conclusion to study different cultural objects and explore their inner strengths and their mutual relations. As you can see from the following slides, when it comes to the visual representation of marks of skin diseases, skin disorders like dermatitis, to the signs of contagious illnesses like syphilis or leprosy, but also to the visual representation of wrinkles, scars, spots, skin blemishes or birthmarks, when it comes to the representation of skin decoration like tattoos, piercing, tanning, the divine stigmata or the demonic marks, the borders between the realm of medical objects and other cultural or artistic productions becomes very elusive. And this is where my third and last criterion comes to the front, which is negotiate. Since we work in a collective and cooperative environment, we will have to negotiate at many times at different fronts. Unlike traditional academic projects based almost exclusively on highly specialized individual training, our projects should benefit through the interaction with a multilingual, plurinational, interdisciplinarity, and intersectional network. Despite of all efforts by sociologists of scientific knowledge to recall and to reveal the hidden procedures of scientific practices, many scholars still believe that negotiations undermine our purity and compromise our goals. My impression, however, is that in the content, conditions, and nature of the way in which medical history is displayed in museums or exhibitions depends on three previous interlinked questions. Who are we? Who is or will be our audience? And who will pay the bills? There are no medical history exhibitions without providing an answer to at least two of these three questions, which has also the advantages that as soon as you know, for example, who pays the bill and who is the audience, it will also become clear who you are. Or if you happen to know who you will be and who will be your audience, it will become clear who should pay the bill. The difficulties, fears, and anxieties, and I'm now to the concluding part of my talk, related to the display of the human body in particular and to the social role of the new humanities in general, have not been triggered by one single cause, but by the combination of a variety of circumstances. Though most of them are very well known to this audience, let me make, nonetheless, a very short recap. In the first place, medical historians, as the rest of scholars working on the humanities and many others working on basic research for that matter, are facing a significant reduction of the budgets. The cuts in research funds are not a global phenomenon, but they affect most of Europe, including Northern Europe and the United States. Secondly, the humanities have not simply lost their wallet, as it were, but also part of their reputation. To the economic crisis and the progressive deterioration of the budgetary conditions, we should add an increasing social indifference and even hostility by other social actors. Third, and equally important, there seems to be no future, or at least there seems to be no clear future here and now for the next generation of scholars. While some of them will eventually succeed in the job hunting somewhere else, from Australia or Eastern Asia to Latin America or the US, many others will find unsurmountable difficulties in their professional careers. The equation between excellence and success, as one of the milestones of our meritocratic modern societies, seems to be also broken here, as in many other instances that I will not bother to mention. Though these three circumstances seem to be economically driven, they are also politically entrenched. To put it clear, the shortage of funds, the increasing absence of prestige, and the lack of future seem to be just the conclusion of a termination of a political model of cooperation between the modern national state on the one hand and the humanities on the other. Even if scholars have very often the feeling that the humanities have been always there and that they will remain there forever, the political model of cooperation between the national state and the humanities is not older than 300 years. It came about as the result of the attempts of historical legitimation of national aspirations and identities, political and economic history, but also the history of the arts, philology, philosophy, not to mention archaeology and archaeological missions, were defended at the highest instances of the state. After all, they provided a narrative of national identity that could be used either as a diplomatic tool or as a menace to scare neighbors. This is not the place, neither the talk, to provide further evidence of this model of cooperation between the humanities and the national states of the 18th and 19th centuries. It will suffice here to say that much of what we, the scholars of the humanities of the late 20th and early 21st century, have been doing during the last 20 or 30 years has called into question the old narratives of modernity. Inspired by critical considerations and by the enjoyment of a 75-year peace period, we have called into question the old national histories, denounced their assumptions, and undermined their tenets. And we have done a very good job. Big national narratives have been substituted by fragmented histories, the old national pride by the social history of the vanquished, as Reihe would have put it. The treatment for the fracture in the old model of cooperation between the humanities and the national state has come up under the form of different remedies. First of all, an increase in the ideology of commensurability, and more specifically in the idea that humanities should imitate not just the research methods, but also the evaluation standards of quantitative sciences. Secondly, an increase in the internationalization of research, avoiding localism and parochialism. Third, an implementation of a principle of accountability, either in terms of formation, research, or money raising. And finally, and here I come back to the point, we have also seen the social pressure to produce some form of knowledge transfer, of public engagement, some form of social value beyond the pure academic impact of high-impact publications published in first-class journals. The discussion of knowledge transfer has become a commonplace within funding and scientific agencies all around Europe. There are no European Commission projects that I know that it will not include a section of impact, whereas most national agencies force the humanities to confess what they are good for, apart from producing highly sophisticated first-class research, very often perceived as completely irrelevant by researchers, evaluators, policymakers, and others. Through this talk, I've attempted to give you some ideas about the diversity of options that museums, collections, and galleries related one way or another to the history of the human body. Even if I try to concentrate on practices of display rather than the history of the collections, my presentation has included many references to the old models, very much based on 19th century ideas of public engagement and education. In a sense, I use them as an excuse to raise more general issues of what we understand by the display of medical history today, and to which extent this kind of activities may provide some insights into the new ways of doing history in the 21st century. The future of medical history display is not written, and this makes the time in which we live even more challenging and interesting. Our novel understanding of the history of the human body in our changing and globalized society must produce significant modifications in the traditional mission and approach of collections, museums, and galleries. We have the challenge to change both the message and the material expression of that message. This change will also be followed by a modification in our ways of research, in the selection of our subject matters, and in our capacity to negotiate and to combine scientific excellence with social relevance. The success of the new values will depend on the ability of those in charge, in my view, to create new products more in consonance with our recent understanding of science and also more adequate to the new demands of society. On this regard, what is usually called trans or multidisciplinarity comes naturally from a better understanding of science and from a much better understanding of culture. I will leave it to you all to determine to which extent these principles that we have examined here, interdisciplinarity and cooperative research, cross-sectoral cooperation, the realization of new topics with new approaches and new publics, open to accountability and negotiation, would also have some value within the expectations of the new humanities. Let me only suggest that perhaps our task as experts on the history of the human body must be counterbalanced by our capacity to generate new narratives and our ability to negotiate and promote a new intellectual and emotional agreement between science and society. So thank you very much.